My name is Georgia, and I'm 38 years old. When I picked up that hammer, I just wanted to fix my fence. Nothing more. My neighbor leaned over, smirking, and said, "You should let a real man handle that, Georgia." I laughed it off, pretending it didn't sting, but something about his tone stayed with me. By nightfall, I heard shouting from his house, glass shattering, a woman crying, and suddenly that fence didn't feel like wood anymore. It felt like a wall between me and something I couldn't ignore. I thought I was fixing my yard, but I was really about to tear apart the secret next door. I live in a quiet cul-de-sac on the outskirts of Raleigh, in a small, sun-faded house that always smells faintly of cedar and paint thinner. It's not much, but it's mine. And after the year I've had, ownership feels like victory. 2 teenagers, a stack of bills, and a heart that still bruises at the word divorce. That's what I woke up to this morning. When my ex-husband, Dean, left me last year for a woman who sells protein shakes online, I promised myself I'd stop waiting for someone else to fix my life. The roof still leaked. The fence leaned like it was bowing out of pity. And my kids, Emma, 16, and Jack, 14, were learning to live inside a house that echoed with missing laughter. So, on this bright Saturday morning, I tied my hair up, pulled on work gloves, and decided to fix that fence once and for all. The boards had warped from years of Carolina rain. The posts leaned so far that even the neighborhood raccoons used them as balance beams. Every time I looked at it, I heard Dean's voice saying, "You'll need a man for that kind of job." Maybe that's why I couldn't leave it another day. The smell of sawdust filled the yard as I pried off the first rotted plank. My hammer clanged in rhythm, steady and determined. Each strike said, "I can do this." My palms burned, my arms ached, but there was a strange comfort in the sound, like therapy disguised as labor. Around mid-morning, while I was measuring a replacement post, a voice floated over the fence. "Well, look at that," it drawled, thick with amusement. "The single mom special, hammer, hope, and half a clue." I froze. Peering over the top of the fence was Calvin Mason, my next-door neighbor. He was in his mid-40s, always wearing a baseball cap and that self-satisfied smirk that came free with his overinflated ego. The kind of man who laughed too loud at his own jokes and looked at women like they were the punchline. "Morning, Calvin," I said tightly, wiping sweat from my forehead. He tilted his head. "You sure you don't want to call a real handyman? Might be safer than pretending." I forced a polite smile, the kind mothers use when their toddlers say something embarrassing in public. "Thanks, but I've got it handled." "Suit yourself," he said, sipping his coffee. "Just hate to see a pretty lady ruin her fence and her manicure." He chuckled and walked away, leaving his words to fester in the humid air. I stared at the fence, nails trembling between my fingers. For a moment, I wanted to throw the hammer through one of the boards. Instead, I steadied my breath and kept working. The truth was, Calvin's comment hit harder than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just him mocking me. It was every whisper I'd heard since the divorce. Poor Georgia. Can she even manage that house alone? Her husband traded up. She's trying so hard, bless her heart. I'd built an invisible fence long before this one, made of pride, embarrassment, and stubborn independence. Today, I was rebuilding both. By noon, the sun had turned cruel. My back ached, my hair stuck to my neck, and sweat dripped into my eyes. I paused to grab a water bottle when I noticed movement behind the Mason's kitchen window. A woman's silhouette, slight, shoulders hunched, glided past. A moment later, Lydia Mason stepped outside, setting a basket of laundry on the patio table. She caught my eye, hesitated, and offered a small, polite wave. Her smile barely lifted the corners of her mouth, as if she was afraid it might draw attention. There was something fragile about her, like glass that had been cracked but never quite shattered. Before I could respond, Calvin's voice barked from inside their house. "Lydia, where's my phone? You can't do anything right." Lydia flinched and hurried back indoors. The door slammed. The sound lingered longer than it should have. I stared at the fence post in my hand, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. I told myself it wasn't my business. I had my own mess to fix, my kids to feed, my pride to mend, but part of me wanted to knock on her door, ask if she was okay. Instead, I picked up my hammer again. By evening, the yard was littered with old boards and bent nails, but the new section stood straight, solid, proud. Emma came outside with lemonade, still in her pajama shorts, earbuds dangling around her neck. "Mom, you've been at this all day," she said. "You sure you don't want help?" I smiled, brushing dirt off my knees. I needed to do this myself. Jack appeared behind her, holding our old dog, Biscuit. "The fence looks better," he said shyly. Compliments from teenage boys are rare treasures. I pocketed that one like gold. When the sun dipped below the rooftops, the air cooled and the neighborhood quieted. I leaned on the hammer, surveying the line of new wood. It wasn't perfect, but it was strong. For the first time in months, I felt something that resembled pride. As I cleaned up, Calvin re-emerged on his deck, beer in hand. "Well, look at that," he called. "Didn't think you'd make it past lunch." I didn't look up. "Guess I proved you wrong." He laughed, the kind of laugh that makes your skin crawl. "Don't take it personal. Just saying, it's a man's job." I set the hammer down with deliberate calm. "Not anymore," I said softly, and went inside. Dinner was leftovers. Macaroni, a few slices of turkey. The kids retreated to their rooms after, and the house settled into that quiet, uneasy peace that fills divorced homes at night. I showered, scrubbed the dirt off my hands, and stared at myself in the bathroom mirror. My reflection looked older, yes, but tougher too. I lay in bed later, the window cracked open to the night breeze. From next door came the faint sound of laughter, Calvin's, harsh and hollow. Then another sound replaced it, Lydia's voice, trembling, pleading. I couldn't make out the words, only the cadence of desperation. A door slammed, something shattered, and then silence, followed by soft, broken sobs. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The newly fixed fence stood between us, strong but thin. I told myself to stay out of it, to mind my own business. But as I listened to Lydia cry on the other side of that fence, I felt the first splinter of doubt drive itself into my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the house sounded like a cry for help. I had thought fixing that fence would bring peace back to my life. Instead, it sounded like the beginning of something I couldn't ignore. The fence became my shield, and my reminder of what I'd lost. The next morning, sunlight crept across my kitchen counter like it was trying to pull me out of bed. My arms ached from the day before, and my palms were raw where the hammer handle had rubbed them pink. But when I looked out the window and saw the fence standing straighter than it had in years, something inside me stirred, a quiet pride I hadn't felt in so long. I poured myself coffee, tied my hair back, and headed outside. The early air was cool and still, thick with dew. The fence glistened faintly where the nails caught the light. Each hammer strike from yesterday had left tiny crescents in the wood, marks of effort, of proof that I was still capable of building something that would last. I got back to work, slipping into that rhythm again. Measure, lift, hammer, breathe. The sound of nails sliding into the boards was oddly calming, almost musical. It drowned out the noise in my head, the what-ifs, the regrets, the echoes of Dean's indifference. For a few hours, there was just me and the wood and the steady thump of progress. Then, inevitably, the peace broke. "Morning again, Georgia." The voice came from over the fence, syrupy sweet and laced with mockery. Calvin Mason stood there, cup of coffee in hand, bathrobe hanging open like he was king of the cul-de-sac. He leaned against the top rail, grin already forming, like he'd been waiting all morning to use it. "Back at it, huh? Don't know how you single moms do it," he said, shaking his head in fake admiration. "You must collect a medal or two from the county for all this hard work." I wiped my brow with my wrist, squinting up at him. "Just keeping things from falling apart." He chuckled. "That why your husband left? Too much falling apart?" The hammer in my hand paused midair. The morning bird seemed to go quiet. I turned toward him slowly. "I don't recall inviting you into my business, Calvin." He blinked, caught off guard. For a second, I saw surprise crack his smug expression. He wasn't used to women talking back, especially not the kind he thought he could toy with. Then came the smirk again. "Hey now, no need to get defensive. I was just making conversation." "Then find another topic," I said evenly, and went back to him. Each strike felt harder, louder, sharper, like punctuation to every insult he'd ever thrown at anyone. A few minutes later, the sliding glass door of the Mason house opened softly. Lydia stepped out, holding a glass of lemonade with condensation running down the sides. She looked fragile in the bright sunlight, pale, her movements cautious, eyes darting like a deer near traffic. "Hi, Georgia," she said softly. "You must be hot. Thought you might want something cold." I smiled, touched by the small kindness. "That's very sweet. Thank you." Before I could finish, Calvin snapped, "Lydia, I told you to leave people alone." She froze mid-step, the lemonade trembling in her hands. A drop spilled over the rim. I said inside. His tone dropped lower, sharper. She nodded quickly and scurried back through the door, the glass still in her hand. The door shut behind her with a soft, final click. I stood there, stunned. My hammer felt suddenly too heavy. I hadn't expected to witness that kind of control, that kind of cruelty, in broad daylight. Calvin looked at me, unbothered, his grin back in place. Women, right? Always trying to fix what's not broken. That was enough. I turned my back to him and hammered harder than ever. Every strike a wordless refusal to acknowledge him again. By late afternoon, the section I'd been working on was done. My arms trembled from fatigue and the air shimmered with heat. I sat on the porch steps staring at the fence. It wasn't perfect, but it stood tall and true, a quiet symbol of defiance. As I sipped water, I heard the faint creak of the mason's back door again. Lydia's voice floated across the fence, tentative. "I'm sorry about before," she whispered. I looked up. She was peeking through one of the slats, only half visible. "You don't need to apologize," I said gently. "He shouldn't talk to you like that." Her eyes darted back toward her house. "He just gets upset sometimes. It's better not to argue." There was something in the way she said it. So practiced, so familiar. I'd heard that tone before in myself years ago, making excuses for Dean's coldness, his dismissive sighs, his distance. I used to tell people, "He's just stressed, he's tired," until I finally realized he was just done. But Calvin wasn't tired or indifferent. He was cruel. As Lydia lifted her arm to brush a strand of hair behind her ear, her sleeve slipped slightly. That's when I noticed it. Purple bruises circling her wrists like fingerprints. I froze. She noticed where my eyes went and quickly tugged the sleeve down. "It's fine," she whispered. "Just an accident." The lie landed heavy in the air between us. I wanted to say something, anything, but fear and caution tangled in my throat. I just nodded, my heart breaking for her silence. That evening, after the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window. The fence gleamed faintly under the porch light, dividing my yard from theirs. It was supposed to be a boundary, a piece of privacy, but now it felt like a shield. On one side was me, patching up the pieces of a broken past. On the other was Lydia, trapped behind the same kind of emotional walls I once hid behind. I thought about Dean, how he never raised a hand to me, but somehow his absence still managed to bruise. He'd withdrawn so quietly that by the time I noticed, I'd been living with a stranger. Maybe emotional neglect was softer, quieter, but it left its own scars. I wondered if Lydia would ever get the chance to feel the relief of being alone, instead of the fear of being watched. I told myself not to get involved. I had my kids to focus on, my bills to pay, my sanity to preserve. There was a reason I'd built that fence strong. It was meant to keep trouble out. But as night fell, the air shifted. From my bedroom window, I could see faint light seeping through the mason's curtains. Shadows moved inside, quick, sharp, uneven. Then came Calvin's voice, booming through the quiet. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Rage, the kind that curdles the air. A loud crash followed, glass shattering, then silence. And after that, the sound that made my blood run cold. A muffled sob, soft but aching, the kind of sound you only make when you're trying not to be heard. I stood frozen at my window, gripping the curtain. The fence between us suddenly felt paper thin. That fence was supposed to protect me. Instead, it was now the only thing separating me from something far darker. When I heard the glass break, I couldn't stay silent anymore. The sound of shattering glass echoed in my chest long after it faded into silence. I sat on the edge of my bed, frozen, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the cicadas outside. For a moment, I told myself I must have imagined it. Maybe it was a dropped dish. Maybe it was... But then I heard it again. Calvin's voice, low and venomous, and something inside me shifted. Without thinking, I threw on my robe, slipped into my sneakers, and stepped out into the yard. The night air was thick, humid, and alive with the smell of cut grass. My hands trembled as I picked up my hammer, pretending to inspect the fence. The light from the mason's kitchen flickered once, then went completely dark. My breath caught. I could still hear muffled voices, Calvin's sharp tone and Lydia's quiet replies, but I couldn't make out words. Just that tone, that sickening blend of power and fear. I leaned on the fence post, listening. Every instinct screamed to call the police, but another voice whispered doubt. What if I'm wrong? What if she doesn't want help? What if it only makes things worse? I stayed there for several long minutes, frozen between courage and fear, until everything went silent. The stillness that followed felt heavier than noise. Eventually, I went back inside, heart still racing. I sat by the window, with my phone in my hand, thumb hovering over the screen. 911. 3 little numbers that could change everything. But what if they arrived and found nothing? What if Lydia denied it? What if Calvin turned that anger on her later? I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the house sounded like a cry for help I couldn't answer. When morning finally came, the neighborhood looked deceptively normal. Lawns glistened with dew, sprinklers ticked rhythmically, and the faint smell of bacon drifted from somewhere down the street. It was hard to believe that only hours before, something violent had cracked the calm. I stepped outside, trying to act casual as I checked the fence line. A moment later, Lydia appeared, holding a small basket of laundry. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen, and she moved stiffly, like every step hurt. "Morning," I said softly. She hesitated, then gave me a faint smile. "Hi, Georgia." Her right wrist was wrapped in a white bandage. She caught me glancing at it and pulled her sleeve down, just like before. "What happened?" I asked carefully. "Oh, just clumsy me," she said quickly, forcing a weak laugh. "Dropped a jar last night. It shattered. I cut myself cleaning it up." I nodded slowly, pretending to believe her, even though my gut screamed otherwise. "Those glass jars can be tricky," I said gently. "You should let me know if you need help fixing anything. I'm pretty good with repairs." For a brief second, something flickered in her eyes, something that looked like gratitude, but she quickly glanced toward her house. I followed her gaze and saw Calvin standing behind the kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching us. His eyes met mine, cold and assessing. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just stared until Lydia hurried back inside. I stood there, jaw tight, the morning breeze suddenly feeling suffocating. Over the next few days, I started noticing more, things I hadn't paid attention to before. Lydia only came outside at certain times and always briefly. When she gardened, she kept one eye on the house. When she took out the trash, she did it quickly, as if she were racing a clock. Calvin, meanwhile, made a show of being the charming neighbor. He'd mow the lawn shirtless, wave to passing cars, chat loudly about sports with whoever would listen. But when Lydia was near, his tone changed, sharp, clipped, and controlling. I'd catch him timing her, literally timing her. He'd glance at his watch when she walked out, then call for her within minutes. Once, when she lingered too long trimming the hedges, I heard him bark. I said 10 minutes. The fear in her movements after that said everything. It was the smallest things that broke me the most. The way Lydia would flinch when a car door slammed, the way she'd smile apologetically every time Calvin interrupted her mid-sentence, the way she'd look at the sky sometimes, as if measuring freedom by the clouds. One afternoon, while I was repainting the new boards of the fence, Lydia came outside again. She hesitated by the corner post, glancing nervously at the house before whispering, "He used to be different, you know." I looked up. Brush paused mid-stroke. "Calvin?" She nodded. "He wasn't always like this. He used to be funny, patient even, but after his construction business went under, something in him snapped. He blames me for it, says I never supported him, that I made him fail." Her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "That's not your fault." Lydia shook her head like she didn't believe it. "He says I should be grateful, that he kept a roof over my head when no one else would." I swallowed hard. I remembered that kind of language, the slow, suffocating way it erodes you. Dean never yelled, but he used silence like a knife. When he left, he told me I'd been too much work. And somehow, even after everything, I believed him for a while. "Lydia," I said gently, "you don't deserve that. You know that, right?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes shimmered, then dropped to the ground. I just want things to go back to how they were. I wanted to tell her that sometimes how they were was the very thing you needed to escape from. But before I could, Calvin's voice called from inside. "Lydia, where the hell are you?" She jumped like she'd been shocked. I should go," she whispered. "Wait." I started, but she was already hurrying back inside. The screen door slammed. I stood there, brush dripping paint onto the dirt, heart pounding with helpless anger. Every instinct in me wanted to storm over there to tell Calvin to back off, to call the police and drag him into the light. But then I thought of Lydia's fear, of how small her voice became when he called her name, and I froze again. That evening, the sun sank low and gold across the fence line. I sat on my porch steps, sipping tea that had long gone cold. The fence looked different now. Not just a boundary, but a kind of barrier I wished I could move. I thought about my own marriage, how I'd once felt trapped too, though in a quieter way. Dean never yelled. He just withdrew, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to reach for. I used to envy women like Lydia, the ones whose husbands still looked at them, still cared enough to fight. Now I saw how wrong that envy was. Some kinds of attention are worse than none. As twilight deepened, I saw movement in the mason yard. Lydia stood by the fence, her arms crossed over her chest. I couldn't tell if she was trembling from fear or the chill. When our eyes met, she took a hesitant step closer. "Georgia," she whispered, voice trembling. "Yeah?" I said softly, setting down my cup. She glanced back toward her house, her lips quivering as if the words themselves were dangerous. I think, she swallowed hard, then whispered, I think I need to get out. Lydia's secret confession changed everything. When Lydia whispered that she needed to get out, I didn't sleep for 2 nights straight. Her words looped through my head like an unfinished sentence. I think I need to get out. Not, I want to, not, I will, just, I think. That kind of hesitation told me everything. She wasn't asking for help. She was asking for permission to imagine freedom. By Wednesday morning, I saw Calvin drive off earlier than usual, his truck rumbling down the street, spitting dust. The moment it disappeared, I caught sight of Lydia standing by her back door, still in her robe, staring across the fence. Our eyes met, and I gave her a small nod, the kind that says, now. 5 minutes later, she motioned for me to come over. I slipped through the gate between our yards, heart hammering in my chest. It was the first time I'd ever stepped onto their side of the fence, and immediately I could feel the difference. The air felt heavier somehow, quieter, like even the walls were holding their breath. Lydia opened the kitchen door and gestured me inside. He's got a meeting out of town, she whispered. We have a few hours. Her kitchen was neat, but suffocatingly still. The air smelled faintly of bleach and stale coffee. I noticed the little details first, the chipped paint on the cabinets, the broken picture frame on the counter, the faint dent in the drywall near the fridge, signs of tempers and apologies. Thank you for coming, she said, twisting her hands together. You don't have to thank me, I replied. You just need to tell me what's going on. She hesitated, then sat at the small kitchen table, exhaling like she'd been holding her breath for years. He doesn't hit me all the time, she began. Not unless I really make him angry. It's more the control, the rules. I stayed silent, letting her talk. He goes through my phone every night, she said quietly. He checks my texts, my email. He even tracks how much gas I use. I'm not allowed to go anywhere that isn't on his approved list. Grocery store, pharmacy, church. Her voice cracked. Even church, Georgia. He sits beside me and keeps his hand on my knee like I'm a dog he has to leash. My chest tightened. I'd known Calvin was cruel, but I hadn't realized how methodical he was. I tried leaving once, she whispered. I packed a bag while he was gone, but he came back early. He said if I ever tried it again, he'd make sure I regretted it. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. You don't have to live like this, Lydia. She looked up at me then, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear, yes, but also something else. Hope, maybe, faint and trembling. I've been saving, she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Little bits of cash from the grocery money. 10 here, 20 there. I keep it hidden in the lining of my purse. How much do you have? Not much, maybe $400. It's taken me almost a year. I nodded slowly. That's a start. She gave a short, disbelieving laugh. A start to what? He checks my accounts. He watches the cameras he installed outside. I don't even know where I'd go. I thought for a moment, scanning the room. You could start by moving some of your things to my garage. A few boxes at a time. Nothing obvious. I'll keep them safe. Lydia stared at me, as if I'd just offered her the moon. You'd do that? Yes, I said simply. No woman should have to feel trapped in her own home. For the first time since I'd known her, she smiled. A real smile. Small but warm, like the first patch of sunlight after weeks of rain. We spent the next hour whispering like conspirators, planning details in between sips of lukewarm coffee. She'd bring small things first, important documents, family photos, her mother's necklace. I'd store them in a box labeled Old Tools at the back of my garage. We'd move slowly, carefully, over the next few weeks. It was dangerous, but so was staying. Around noon, Lydia suddenly froze. His truck, she whispered. I followed her gaze through the blinds. Sure enough, Calvin's truck was rolling into the driveway. My stomach dropped. I thought he was gone all day. So did I, she said, panic rising in her voice. You have to go. Now. I grabbed my purse, moving quickly toward the back door. Just act normal. I'll handle it. As I stepped into the yard, the gravel crunched under my shoes. I forced myself to look calm, crossing to my side of the fence just as Calvin rounded the corner of his house. Well, well, he said, his tone oily with suspicion. Fancy seeing you here, Georgia. I forced a light laugh. Oh, hey, Calvin. Lydia asked if I could look at the hinge on her garden gate. It's loose. He eyed me for a long moment, his jaw tightening. Did she now? Yeah, I said, picking up my tape measure from the fence post. I was just about to get back to my side and finish the repairs. He didn't say anything else, just watched me walk away. I could feel his stare between my shoulder blades all the way to my porch. When I finally got inside, my hands were shaking. I looked out through the window and saw him go inside, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the glass. A few minutes later, I caught a glimpse of Lydia at the window. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. I wanted to believe she'd be okay, but something in my gut told me Calvin wouldn't let her quiet rebellion go unpunished. That night, I was halfway through folding laundry when there was a knock at the door. I hesitated, heart thudding. When I peeked through the peephole, Calvin was standing there. I opened the door, only a crack. "Evening, Calvin. Everything all right?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just checking the fence line. Thought I saw you working close to my property today." I swallowed. "Yeah, just making sure the boards are even, trying to keep it sturdy." He nodded slowly, gaze drifting over my shoulder into the house. "You're a real handy one, aren't you? Guess you like fixing what's broken." "Some things are worth fixing," I said carefully. He chuckled. "Well, don't go fixing what isn't yours." I kept my voice even. "Good night, Calvin." He lingered a moment longer, then finally turned and walked back to his yard. I locked the door the second it shut. My heart pounded in my ears, the warning clear beneath his fake civility. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to be dangerous. The next morning, when I stepped outside with my coffee, I noticed something strange. One of my new fence posts was leaning slightly, splintered near the bottom. I walked closer and saw it. A muddy boot print pressed into the wood. Calvin's size, Calvin's tread. I didn't need proof. I already knew. He was sending a message, and I just declared war without meaning to. He tried to intimidate me, so I hammered harder. I stared at that muddy boot print for a long time. The morning sun was just high enough to make the damp earth gleam, highlighting every ridge in the tread. It wasn't just vandalism. It was a message, a warning. Calvin Mason didn't need to say the words out loud. They were pressed into the grain of my fence like a threat carved in stone. For a moment, I felt the same chill that used to wash over me when Dean would come home in one of his quiet moods, the kind where silence weighed heavier than shouting. But then the fear gave way to something else, something hotter. I set down my coffee, grabbed my hammer, and went to work. The fence had already become more than a home project. It was my boundary, my independence, my line in the sand. If Calvin thought breaking a post would scare me back into submission, he was about to learn how wrong he was. Each hammer strike rang out across the yard, sharp and deliberate. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The rhythm felt like my heartbeat, steady and unyielding. I replaced the broken board, then another, then reinforced the base with fresh screws. My arms ached, my palms burned, but I didn't stop. Every nail I drove into that wood was a wordless answer to his threat. By the time I stepped back, sweat ran down my spine, but the fence looked stronger than before, taller somehow, prouder. That's when I saw him. Calvin was on his porch, lounging in a chair, coffee mug in hand, wearing that same condescending grin. "Morning, Georgia," he called out, voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Didn't mean to scare you the other day. Guess I got a little too close to your precious fence." I said nothing. He chuckled. "You really ought to hire a guy to help with that. All that hammering. Kind of desperate, don't you think? Lonely women with tools. Sounds like a bad country song." I kept my eyes on the wood, hammering another nail. Thunk. "That's some temper you've got," he added. "Careful, or you'll scare off the next man brave enough to date you." Thunk. The metal hit the wood with a sharper crack this time. My grip tightened, and the vibrations ran up my arm, but I didn't stop. Thunk. Finally, he went quiet. Maybe he realized I wasn't going to bite, or maybe he saw that the harder he pushed, the stronger I built. Either way, I heard his screen door creak as he went back inside. For the first time in days, I felt in control again. Not because I'd beaten him, but because I refused to let him break me. Around midday, Emma wandered out, still wearing one of my old t-shirts. "Mom, you're at it again?" she said, smiling faintly. "Yeah," I said, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Might as well finish while I'm on a roll." She picked up a paintbrush from the box nearby. "Can I help?" That simple question hit me harder than Calvin's words ever could. My daughter hadn't volunteered to spend time with me in months, not since Dean left. I nodded quickly before my throat could tighten. "Of course, sweetheart. Grab some gloves." A few minutes later, Jack joined us too, dragging his sneakers across the grass. "I'll help paint," he said, pretending not to care, but clearly curious. So the three of us worked side by side under the warm Carolina sun, paint streaks smudging our arms, and laughter filling the space that had felt so empty for so long. For the first time since the divorce, I saw something like joy in their faces. The hammering, the painting, the laughter, it all drew attention. Neighbors walking their dogs slowed down to wave, nodding in quiet approval. A few even stopped to say the fence looked good. Calvin stayed silent. Every time I caught him watching, he'd quickly look away. And then something unexpected began to happen. Lydia started changing too. Over the next few days, she came outside more often. She'd water her flowers with her shoulders a little straighter, her steps a little slower, like she was daring him to notice. She even smiled once, really smiled, when she caught me watching. Calvin still barked at her from time to time, but I saw the shift. His power over her was slipping. One nail, one board, one act of defiance at a time. I kept my promise too. Every evening after dark, Lydia would quietly pass a small box over the fence. Clothes, photo albums, a few keepsakes. I'd tuck them into my garage under an old tarp marked paint supplies. Each hidden box was a small victory. One evening, as the sky turned orange and lavender, Lydia appeared again at the fence. She looked nervous, glancing back at her house, then at me. When I reached out to take another small jewelry box from her hand, she pressed something else into my palm, a simple gold band, her wedding ring. "For luck," she whispered. I stared at it, the cool metal resting against my calloused fingers. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I don't want to wear it anymore." Before I could respond, she turned and hurried back toward her house. I held that ring for a long time that night, turning it over between my fingers. It felt heavier than it looked, not because of the gold, but because of what it represented. Years of promises, years of pain, and now, maybe, a chance to start again. As I tucked it into a drawer beside my bed, I caught sight of Calvin's shadow crossing his yard. He paused near the fence, his outline framed by the dim porch light. For a moment I thought he might try something again, but I stood up and faced the window. This time, I didn't look away. He eventually turned and went back inside. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Maybe because I'd finally decided that fear wasn't going to dictate my life anymore. The next morning was peaceful. I made pancakes for Emma and Jack, and we laughed about how uneven they turned out. For a few precious minutes, the world felt normal, but peace in this neighborhood never lasted long. Later that afternoon, as I was cleaning brushes in the sink, my phone buzzed. It was a voicemail. Lydia's number. My stomach tightened instantly. She never called during the day. I played it on speaker, my heart already racing. Her voice came through, trembling, rushed, almost whispering. "Georgia, it's me. Please, tomorrow. Please be ready." And then silence. No explanation, no goodbye. Just that one sentence, heavy with urgency. I stood frozen, the sound of the voicemail replaying in my mind. Tomorrow. Whatever was coming, it wasn't just another broken fence or another sleep. It was something bigger, the escape plan. I barely slept after Lydia's voicemail. Every hour I'd glance at my phone again, checking if she'd sent more details. She hadn't. Just that one message. Tomorrow. Please be ready. By dawn, I was already pacing the kitchen, coffee untouched, staring through the blinds at the mason's yard. The air outside felt heavy with expectation, like even the birds were holding their breath. I kept replaying the plan in my head. Every step, every second accounted for. Calvin always left early on Saturdays, for his golf league, driving to a course 40 minutes away. Lydia had told me he left by 7:15 a.m. sharp and didn't return until late afternoon. It was the one window she had, the only crack in the walls he'd built around her. We'd been preparing for this moment quietly for weeks. I'd cleared a corner in my garage and tucked her packed boxes beneath old paint tarps, each one carefully labeled with decoy words like winter coats or garden tools. Lydia had worked meticulously, slipping small items into grocery bags whenever she could. Now all we needed was one ride. That's where Mindy, my cousin, came in. Mindy was the kind of woman who ran on caffeine and chaos, but she had a reliable minivan and a fierce sense of loyalty. When I called her 2 nights ago, she didn't even hesitate. "Of course I'll help," she said. "Where's she going?" "Out of town. She has a sister a few hours away," I told her. Mindy had sighed through the phone. "Good. You just tell me when and where. I'll keep the engine running." Now that when had arrived. At 6:45 a.m., I stood in my driveway pretending to tidy up, eyes glued to Calvin's house. Through his kitchen window, I saw movement, a dark shape pacing back and forth. Then the front door opened. Calvin emerged in his golf polo, sunglasses perched on his head, a smug confidence in every step. He loaded his clubs into the back of his truck, slammed the tailgate, and climbed in. My pulse jumped as the engine roared to life. He backed out of the driveway, turned onto the main road, and disappeared. I exhaled shakily. It was 7:15 on the dot. I texted Lydia one word, "Now." Seconds later, her back door opened. She slipped out quietly, a duffel bag over her shoulder, eyes darting toward the street. Her steps were small but fast, her fear visible even in the way she breathed. When she reached the fence gate, I pushed it open from my side. She dropped the bag and threw her arms around me. "Thank you," she whispered, voice breaking. I hugged her tight. "We've got you. It's almost over." Tears streaked down her cheeks, but there was relief in her eyes. Real relief, fragile but real. Mindy's van pulled up at the curb right on schedule, its engine humming low. She gave me a quick nod from the driver's seat, sunglasses hiding her expression. Lydia and I moved fast. We carried the boxes from my garage, loading them one by one into the van. Each one felt heavier than it should have, not from weight, but from what it meant. Every box was a piece of Lydia's stolen freedom being reclaimed. Halfway through, the air changed. The low rumble of an engine cut through the quiet street. My blood turned cold. I looked up, and there it was, Calvin's truck, turning the corner, rolling back toward the house. "Oh, God!" Lydia whispered, panic flashing across her face. "He's back! Hide!" I hissed. She ducked behind the fence, pressing herself against the boards. I grabbed my hammer from the porch, forcing my shaking hands to steady. Calvin's truck pulled into the driveway. He slammed the door harder than necessary, muttering to himself as he walked toward the house. I could hear the clatter of keys, the jingle of his phone as he retrieved it from the kitchen counter. I tried to breathe evenly, pretending to hammer one of the fence posts, every muscle in my body screaming with tension. Then his voice cut through the air. "Morning again, Georgia." I turned slowly, forcing a smile. "Morning, Calvin. Thought you were off to golf." He frowned. "Forgot my phone. Thought I heard something out here." His gaze swept the yard, lingering on the van parked near the curb. My stomach twisted. "That's my cousin," I said quickly. "She's helping me move some old boxes." He raised an eyebrow. "This early?" I shrugged. "She's a morning person." He studied me for a long, unnerving moment, the silence thick between us. I could feel Lydia's breath on the other side of the fence, the faintest rustle of her sleeve as she tried not to move. Calvin stepped closer, squinting toward the van. "Funny, that doesn't look like paint supplies in there." I gripped the hammer tighter. "It is. Just tools, tarps, stuff like that." He smirked. "You always did have an answer for everything." Inside the van, Mindy revved the engine once, ready but anxious. "Everything all right?" she called out, her voice just a little too bright. "Yeah," I replied, forcing cheerfulness. "Just chatting with my neighbor." Calvin's jaw tightened. He took another step forward, his tone dropping lower. "You seem awfully nervous for someone who's just fixing a fence." I met his gaze. "Maybe I don't like being watched while I work." The words hung there, heavier than they should have been. Finally, he chuckled, cold and humorless. "You really are something, Georgia." He turned and walked back toward his truck, muttering about nosy neighbors. I waited until I heard the engine start again before daring to move. "Go!" I hissed toward the fence. "Now!" Lydia slipped out from behind it, tears streaming silently down her face. We carried the last box, just one, and placed it gently in the van. Mindy reached out and squeezed Lydia's hand. "You're safe now, honey. Let's go." But before the door shut, before they could even shift into drive, the sound of an engine came roaring back. Calvin's truck. He turned around. The truck screeched into the driveway, brakes squealing. Lydia froze halfway into the van, eyes wide. I stepped between her and the fence, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The driver's side door slammed. "Lydia!" Calvin's voice bellowed across the yard, filled with suspicion and fury. The van engine revved. Mindy's knuckles tightened around the steering wheel. "Go!" I shouted. But Calvin's footsteps were already thundering across the gravel, his voice rising. "Lydia, get out here now." I stood in his line of sight, blocking the van from view as best I could, hammer in hand, heart in my throat. Everything we'd built, the plan, the trust, the fragile hope, it all hung in the air, one heartbeat away from shattering. And then the van engine roared louder. Tires squealed. Calvin turned toward the sound. "Lydia!" he shouted again, disbelief breaking into rage. The fence that divided us became my weapon. Calvin's shout sliced through the morning air like a knife. "Lydia?" His voice was raw, furious, confused, and louder than I'd ever heard it. The neighborhood fell silent around us. Even the birds seemed to stop mid-song. I could hear Lydia's quick breaths behind the fence, the rasp of fear she was trying to hold in. Mindy's van engine idled by the curb, the faint rumble barely audible over the hammering of my heart. I didn't have time to think, only to act. Calvin rounded the corner of his yard, his face twisted with suspicion. His eyes darted from the van to me, narrowing. What the hell's going on here, Georgia? I stepped forward quickly, gripping my hammer, forcing my voice to stay calm. Just fixing the boards again. You kicked one loose, remember? He didn't buy it. His gaze flicked back toward the van, then to the fence. His voice dropped an octave, rough and dangerous. Where is she? I took another step forward, blocking his line of sight. I told you, I'm just working. He laughed, a low, humorless sound. Don't lie to me. I heard her. I held his stare. You're mistaken. Don't play stupid, he roared, moving closer. You think I don't know what you've been doing? All those whispers, all those late-night chats? You've been meddling in my marriage. His words shot out like bullets, each one meant to wound. But I didn't flinch. Not this time. Behind me, I heard Lydia shift, her breath catching in her throat. I prayed she'd stay still. Calvin stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the bitter tang of his coffee and cologne. Where is my wife? I lifted my hammer, resting it lightly against the top of the nearest board, pretending to focus on the wood. Maybe she's finally where she feels safe. His expression twisted, rage bubbling to the surface. He reached out suddenly and grabbed the fence post, trying to yank it down. The wood creaked, groaning under the pressure. Stop, I warned, my voice sharp. He ignored me, pulling harder. You think you can hide her from me? You think you can just take what's mine? Something inside me snapped, not in fear, but in resolve. I raised the hammer high and slammed it down, driving the nail back into the post just inches from his fingers. The crack of metal on wood split the air like thunder. He jerked his hand back instinctively. Don't, I said, my voice steady, each syllable cutting through the charged air. You don't scare me anymore. For the first time since I'd known him, Calvin hesitated. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked between me and the fence, his bravado cracking like a cheap veneer. The echo of my hammer still hung in the air when, from behind the fence, came the sound we'd been waiting for, the screech of tires. Mindy's van. Lydia was gone. Calvin's head whipped toward the street. No! He shouted, sprinting toward the front yard. I turned in time to see the van's taillights disappear around the corner, sunlight flashing off the rear window. Lydia's hand pressed briefly against the glass, a fleeting goodbye. Calvin ran into the middle of the road, screaming her name, his voice breaking into something unrecognizable. His rage echoed down the quiet cul-de-sac. Lydia, you can't just leave. But it was too late. She was free. He turned back toward me, his face flushed red, his breathing ragged. You, he spat. You did this. I stood my ground. She did it. She chose herself. He stormed toward me again, fists clenched. You think this is over? You think you can just... The sharp wail of sirens cut him off. 2 police cars rounded the corner, lights flashing blue and red against the white fences and neat lawns. The sight stopped Calvin mid-stride. He spun toward them, shouting, She kidnapped my wife! The officers stepped out calmly, hands resting on their holsters. Sir, step back, one said firmly. She's gone because of her. Calvin pointed at me, eyes wild. That woman's been interfering. She took her. I spoke before the officers could respond. I didn't take anyone. She left of her own choice, and I have evidence of everything you've done to her. The taller officer looked at me carefully. You called this in earlier, right? Said there might be a domestic situation? Yes, I said. My hands were trembling, but my voice didn't waver. She was afraid for her life. Calvin's outrage turned frantic. You can't do this. She's my wife. Not anymore, I said quietly. That was when he lunged for the fence again, pure rage driving him. But the officers moved faster. One grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back, the other snapping cuffs into place with a swift metallic click. Calvin cursed, shouted, fought, but they held firm. Sir, you need to calm down, the officer warned. Calvin's words turned inherent rage, echoing through the neighborhood. Curtains shifted in windows. Faces appeared behind glass. Everyone was watching. The officers led him to the car, still shouting threats that no one listened to anymore. I stood there, gripping my hammer, heart pounding. The same fence he'd mocked, kicked, and vandalized now stood between us like armor. Sturdy, unbreakable. I'd built it to protect my home, but in the end, it had protected something far greater. As the police car door slammed shut, Calvin's voice faded beneath the hum of the engine. The vehicle rolled down the street, turning the corner where Lydia's van had vanished minutes earlier. The silence that followed was immense. Mindy jogged back toward my yard, her face pale but determined. She's safe, she said, breathless. We're heading south. She's going to be okay. I nodded, relief flooding me so hard my knees nearly gave out. You all right? Mindy asked. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. Yeah, I whispered. Now I am. She squeezed my shoulder, gave me a small smile, then hurried back to her van. When the police finished taking my statement, one of them glanced toward the fence and nodded approvingly. That's a good solid build, he said. I let out a weak laugh. You have no idea. By the time they left, the sun had climbed high overhead. The smell of cedar and dust hung in the air. I leaned against the fence, letting the weight of the morning sink in. Everything felt different, quieter, lighter, real. The hammer was still in my hand, warm from the sun. I stared at it for a long moment, realizing it had never just been a tool. It was strength. It was voice. It was defiance. As I turned to go inside, my phone buzzed. A new message. From Lydia. I opened it, heart pounding. Just one word appeared on the screen. Free. I sank to the grass, the phone trembling in my hands. Tears welled up, spilling over as I whispered the word aloud, tasting its weight, its grace, its truth. Free. For her. For me. And for the fence that had divided us, but in the end had brought us both strength. After the hammering stopped, silence felt like victory. The yard was unnervingly quiet after everything ended. Even the air seemed hesitant to move, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for me to finally exhale. When the police car pulled away with Calvin in the back seat, the last sound of its tires faded into something that felt dangerously close to peace. For the first time in months, there was no shouting from next door, no slamming doors, no breaking glass, just silence. And silence, I realized, could be the sweetest sound in the world when you've been living beside chaos. The officers had spent hours at the Mason house that morning. After Calvin's arrest, they found more than any of us wanted to know. Holes in the walls, broken furniture, photos with the glass shattered, and evidence of control so calculated it made me sick. Hidden cameras, tracking devices, even a list of Lydia's daily routines written out in his handwriting. When the police came to my door to thank me for calling ahead, I didn't feel heroic. I just felt tired and relieved that she was gone before he had the chance to stop her. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than gossip at a church bake sale. By afternoon, people who'd once waved politely from their porches were suddenly at my door with casseroles and sympathy. Everyone had noticed something, but hadn't known what to do. I wanted to be angry at them for their silence, but I couldn't, because I understood. We all tell ourselves not to get involved, that it's not our business, that maybe things aren't as bad as they look. I'd told myself that too, right up until the night I heard glass break. Emma and Jack watched all of it unfold with wide, uncertain eyes. They'd stood at the window the morning the police came, whispering to each other, trying to make sense of the chaos. That evening, as I tucked them into bed, Emma said softly, "Mom, you were really brave." The words made my throat tighten. "I just did what anyone would do," I said. She shook her head. "No, you didn't just watch." Jack chimed in quietly from the other bed. "You fixed it." I smiled faintly. "Yeah," I whispered. "I guess I did." The next morning I went out to the yard. The fence looked battle-worn, splintered in spots from Calvin's rage, but still standing, stronger than ever. The boards I'd nailed myself gleamed in the early light, golden and sturdy. I picked up my hammer again, the same one that had echoed through so many tense mornings, and started to repair the final section. Each nail I drove into place was steady, calm, rhythmic, not furious this time, but sure. The sound no longer felt like defiance, it felt like healing. As the days passed, the neighborhood seemed to soften. People stopped by more often, not out of pity, but gratitude. Mrs. Talbot from across the street brought over a basket of muffins. The Jenkins kids drew a picture of my strong fence and taped it to my mailbox. It was awkward, but kind, and for the first time since the divorce, I felt like I belonged here. Lydia, meanwhile, was safe. She'd called the police station from a rest stop hours away to confirm she was okay. Then, a few days later, she sent a text that simply read, "At my sister's. Thank you. Don't worry about me anymore." Weeks passed before I heard from her again. Life began to settle into something resembling normal. My mornings filled with coffee, chores, and quiet satisfaction. Calvin's house sat empty, its windows dark, its yard overgrown with weeds. One afternoon, a small envelope arrived in the mail. The handwriting was neat but shaky. The postmark was from South Carolina. Inside was a postcard, an image of a small seaside town, sunlight glinting off blue water. On the back, in Lydia's careful script, were just 3 words, "You saved me." I sat at the kitchen table staring at it, tears slipping down my cheeks. Not loud tears, not the kind that come from pain, but the quiet, cleansing kind that come when you finally let go of something heavy. For a long time, I'd believed that strength meant never breaking, that if I just stayed busy enough, tough enough, I could hold my world together by sheer will. But that fence taught me otherwise. It wasn't about refusing to break. It was about rebuilding every time life tried to tear you down. In fixing that fence, I hadn't just repaired wood and nails. I'd rebuilt parts of myself I thought were gone. The part that still believed in my own worth. The part that still believed in helping someone even when it terrified me. The part that remembered what it felt like to stand up, even when your knees shook. Emma and Jack started seeing me differently after that summer. Not as the tired single mom struggling to keep things together, but as something else. Steady, capable, unafraid. I caught them bragging once to a neighbor kid. Our mom helped someone get away from a bad man. That night, I stood by the window with a cup of tea, watching the moonlight cast soft silver lines across the fence. The boards gleamed like quiet sentinels, standing guard between what was and what would be. For the first time in years, I felt peace, not just in my home, but inside myself. The silence that used to haunt me no longer felt empty. It felt like victory. I started gardening again, filling the yard with color. Sunflowers, lavender, hydrangeas. Emma helped me plant them, saying she wanted the yard to feel alive again, and slowly it did. I still thought about Lydia sometimes, where she was, what she was doing, whether she'd learned to sleep through the night without fear. I hoped she had. Her postcard stayed pinned on my fridge, next to a photo of Emma and Jack at the beach. Every time I saw it, I whispered a quiet promise to myself, never be silent again. As the weeks rolled into months, the Mason house was finally listed for sale. The sign went up one Friday morning, tilting slightly in the soft dirt. I thought I'd feel relief, but instead, I just felt closure. The house wasn't evil. It was just broken, like so many of us had been. By the end of summer, a moving truck pulled up next door. I watched from the porch as a family stepped out. A man unloading boxes, a woman guiding a little girl by the hand. The woman's face caught my attention. She was young, maybe early 30s, but her eyes held that same tentative look Lydia used to have, the look of someone trying to hold herself together in unfamiliar ground. She caught me watching and smiled awkwardly. I smiled back. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I called, waving. She hesitated, then waved in return. "Thank you," she said softly. As they unpacked, I noticed her glancing around the yard, studying the fence that now stood tall and unyielding between our homes. That fence used to feel like a barrier. Now it felt like a promise, a line I'd learned to protect not just for myself, but for anyone who might one day need it. I didn't know her story, but I knew the signs. And if history had taught me anything, it was that silence breeds suffering. I'd been silent once. I wouldn't be again. That night, as crickets sang and porch lights flickered on, I stood by the fence one last time, running my hand across its smooth surface. The boards were cool beneath my fingertips, strong and whole. The hammer was back in the shed where it belonged. The air smelled of lilacs and peace. After everything, silence didn't mean emptiness anymore. It meant survival. Every fence has two sides, but strength grows on both. The day my new neighbors moved in felt strangely familiar. The squeak of the moving truck's brakes, the thud of boxes against the driveway, the uncertain laughter of people starting over. I stood on my porch with my morning coffee, watching them come and go. The woman, Sabrina, as I later learned, moved slowly, carefully, her dark hair pulled into a neat bun, her smile tight around the edges. There was a weight in her posture I recognized instantly, though I didn't know her story yet. Emma and Jack were tossing a football in the yard, arguing good-naturedly over who had dropped the last pass. Their laughter drifted through the air, warm and ordinary, a sound I'd once feared I'd never hear again. I took a slow sip of coffee, feeling the steam brush against my face. Life had finally settled into something steady, something I could breathe inside of. I watched as Sabrina struggled with a heavy box near the curb. Without thinking, I set down my mug and walked toward the fence. "Need a hand?" I called. She looked up, startled, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Oh, no, that's all right. I've got it." "Trust me," I said, smiling. I said the same thing once and nearly threw my back out. "Let me help." Her hesitant laugh broke the tension. Together, we lifted the box, kitchenware, judging by the clinking sounds, and carried it up the short path to her porch. "Thank you," she said. "I'm Sabrina, by the way. We're just getting settled in." "Georgia," I said, shaking her hand. "Welcome to the neighborhood." Her grip was light, her palms rough with the faint calluses of someone who's done more than her share of hard work. Behind her, a man I assumed was her husband carried another box inside. Speaking to a small girl who looked about 7, the child waved shyly at me before disappearing through the door. Once we finished unloading, Sabrina and I ended up sitting on the back porch steps, sharing a pitcher of lemonade she'd found in one of her boxes. Through the thin slats of the fence between our yards, sunlight streamed in, casting stripes across the grass. "This place," she said softly, looking around. "It feels like a new start. My husband just got transferred here. We needed a change. New starts can be good," I said. "Scary, but good." She smiled faintly. "You've been here long?" "About 5 years," I said. "But it only started feeling like home recently." Sabrina glanced at the fence between us, tilting her head. "You built this yourself, didn't you?" I laughed lightly. "You can tell?" "Oh, yes. It's too straight to be old and too personal to be store-bought." She was right. That fence had my fingerprints on every inch of it. Each board had been hammered into place by my own hands, first with desperation, then with anger, then finally with peace. It wasn't just wood anymore, it was a timeline of everything I'd survived. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to our kids play in the distance. It struck me then how much had changed. Just a year ago, this yard had felt like a battlefield. Now, it was just a yard, filled with sunlight, laughter, and the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. Sabrina broke the silence. Moving is harder than I expected. I keep worrying I'm doing everything wrong. My daughter misses her friends already." I turned to her, seeing that familiar flicker of exhaustion and self-doubt. It was the same one I'd worn for years. "You're doing fine," I said gently. "Starting over doesn't mean you're lost. It just means you're brave enough to try again." She looked at me for a moment, eyes glistening with something unspoken. "You make it sound easy." I smiled. "It's not, but it gets easier when you have people who get it." Sabrina nodded, taking a slow sip of lemonade. I could tell she wanted to ask what I meant, but she didn't. Instead, she glanced toward the fence again, studying the freshly painted boards. I hesitated, then added softly, "If you ever need help, don't wait too long to ask." Her eyes met mine, and for a brief second I saw the faintest flash of understanding pass between us. She didn't ask for clarification. She didn't need to. After she went inside, I lingered by the fence, listening to the muffled sound of her daughter's laughter drifting through the open window. Something inside me settled, the kind of peace that comes when you know you've broken a cycle, even if just a small one. Back inside my own kitchen, I glanced at the refrigerator. Lydia's postcard still hung there, edges curling slightly from time. The photo of that little seaside town hadn't faded yet. The blue water still sparkled under the sunlight. "You saved me." Those 3 words had become more than a message. They were a reminder of what it meant to stand up, of what it meant to care, of how strength isn't loud. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, and made of wood and nails and patience. I touched the corner of the postcard lightly, smiling to myself. Emma and Jack burst through the back door a moment later, arguing over whose turn it was to clean up after Biscuit. Their laughter filled the house again, full, unguarded, alive. It made the walls feel lighter somehow. "Dinner in 20, I called, shaking my head as they sprinted upstairs. When the house fell quiet again, I wandered out to the yard, hammer in hand. The late afternoon sun painted everything gold, turning the fence into a long line of honey-colored light. A few of the older boards near the edge had started to loosen with the change in weather. I knelt down, pressing one back into place. The hammer felt good in my hand, familiar, balanced, steady. I drove one last nail into the board, the metallic clink echoing across the yard. It wasn't the angry, desperate sound it used to be. It was softer, rhythmic, the sound of completion. As I stood up, I looked around at what I'd built, not just the fence, but the life inside it. My kids, my home, my peace, all of it shaped by struggle, held together by effort, and protected by boundaries I'd learned to respect. Strength, I realized, doesn't always come from revenge. Sometimes it comes from rebuilding what others tried to break, and doing it better than before. The sun began to dip behind the trees, streaking the sky with amber and pink. I leaned against the fence, the wood still warm from the day's light. I thought of Lydia, of her freedom, of her new beginning somewhere near the sea. I thought of Sabrina, of the uncertain courage blooming quietly behind her polite smile. And I thought of myself, of the woman I used to be, the one who thought fixing a fence could somehow fix her life. I smiled, watching the sky shift from orange to gold. Maybe, in a way, it had. As the final sliver of sun slipped beneath the horizon, I lifted the hammer one last time and tapped the final nail into place. The sound rang out through the still evening air, clear and certain, like punctuation at the end of a long, unfinished sentence. I ran my hand along the smooth wood, breathing in the scent of cedar and earth. My reflection shimmered faintly in the sheen of the boards. A little older, a little stronger, but finally at peace. This time, I whispered into the fading light, I built it for peace. And for the first time, I believed it. Some fences keep people apart, others keep the wrong ones out. I built mine to protect my peace and to remind myself that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just stands quietly, board by board, refusing to fall again. In the end, I didn't just fix a fence, I rebuilt my life, stronger, steadier, and finally free. If my story moved you, take a second to share it, because someone out there might need the reminder that silence can be broken. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that prove even quiet voices change everything. And tell me one thing in the comments. Have you ever stood up for someone when everyone else stayed silent?